There's a drill entering my skull right now. Has been for 3,000 years. Except there is no drill. Just the memory of one, looping endlessly through the psychic network we're all trapped in, shared between 4,000 screaming minds who can't stop broadcasting every moment of their torture. My name is Cale Vorson. Was Cale Vorson. The distinction matters less each century. Let me take you back. Before the iron. Before the null circuitry. Before I learned that consciousness without a body is the worst thing you can inflict on a human being, and that the Imperium had perfected the art of doing exactly that. I was 17 when they came for me. 17 years, 4 months, 11 days. I remember because it was my brother Tom's birthday, and we'd saved enough ration coupons to get him real protein, not the recycled corpse starch the hive undercities usually provided. The memory is crystal clear because I've relived it approximately 47 million times through the psychic loop. Every detail burned into whatever serves as my consciousness now. Sanctus Hive on Caledon 3, 7th sublevel, where the condensation from the upper levels created a constant drizzle that smelled like rust and human waste. Our hab unit was 4 meters by 3 meters. 6 of us lived there. Me, Tom, our father Gregor, my uncle Marcus, and 2 cousins whose names I can still sometimes remember when the psychic interference isn't too severe. Jonas and the other one. His face is there in my memory, but the name glitches, replaced by data streams and the screaming of prisoner 2847, who's been reliving his own death for 4 centuries. I was a loader in the manufactorum, 12-hour shifts moving components I didn't understand for machines I'd never see completed. My hands. I remember my hands, the calluses on my palms from the loading hooks, the scar on my left thumb from when I was 8 and didn't move fast enough when the press came down. Sometimes I can still feel them. The phantom sensation is worse than the absence would be, because I know they're not there. Know my body was recycled decades ago. But my consciousness insists I can flex fingers that haven't existed since before some of the other prisoners were even born. The psychic manifestation started small, manageable. I'd know what Tom was feeling before he spoke. Nervousness, hunger, the dull ache of a bruised rib from where a supervisor had kicked him for moving too slowly. I thought everyone could do this. Assumed the tightness in my chest when my father was sad was just being observant, paying attention to body language. Then I started hearing thoughts, not words exactly, impressions. The supervisor 3 levels up planning to reduce our protein ration again. The clerk in the distribution center fantasizing about his dead son. The enforcer patrolling sub-level 8 thinking about how much he'd enjoy beating someone, anyone, just to feel powerful for once. I told my father, biggest mistake of my 17 years, 4 months, 11 days. He went pale, not gradually, instantly like someone had drained blood from his face through a spigot. His hands started shaking, and I felt his terror before he even spoke, this overwhelming wave of absolute horror that made me step backward even though I didn't understand why. Never, he whispered, grabbing my shoulders hard enough to bruise, never speak of this to anyone. Do you understand me, Cale? Anyone. But he was already calculating. I felt his thoughts crystallize. Tell no one, maybe it'll pass. Maybe the administrator won't notice. Maybe we can hide it. And underneath those desperate hopes, the certainty that we couldn't, that we were already doomed. The black ships came 3 weeks later. I don't know if my father reported me or if they had other methods of detection. Some psychic resonance scanner, some betrayal from a coworker who'd noticed me flinching at thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud. Doesn't matter. The result was the same. They arrived at shift change, when sublevel 7 was crowded with workers transitioning between the day and night cycles. 12 figures in black armor with the inquisitorial seal on their shoulders. I felt them before I saw them. Their minds were wrong, blank spaces wrapped in something that made my skull ache just by proximity. Blanks, nulls, pariahs. The Imperium's weapon against people like me, one pointed, directly at me through a crowd of 300. His mind was a void, an absence that pulled at my consciousness like a drain pulling water. I tried to run. My legs wouldn't move, not because he'd stopped me physically, but because his presence was an anti-psychic field that made my brain forget how to send signals to my muscles. I collapsed, faced first into the metal grating, tasted blood from my split lip, felt my father's anguish like a knife in my chest, his guilt and self-hatred and love all tangled together as he watched them drag me toward the transport. "The Emperor protects," someone in the crowd murmured, the traditional response to inquisitorial presence, the automatic phrase we'd all been trained to say when authority manifested. He didn't protect me. The transport was a black box, literally. No windows, no light, just metal walls, and the presence of 6 blanks whose anti-psychic fields made my skin crawl and my thoughts scatter like roaches in sudden illumination. I wasn't alone. 14 others were crammed into the space, all of us psychically sensitive, all of us experiencing the same drowning sensation as our abilities were suppressed by proximity to walking negation. A girl. "No. Stop. Restart." Another prisoner started screaming. Young, maybe 15. I couldn't sense his thoughts through the blank field, but I didn't need to. His eyes said everything. This was the first time he'd ever been completely alone in his own head, and the silence was driving him insane. They didn't tell us where we were going. Didn't need to. We all knew. Every child in the Imperium grows up hearing about the black ships, the great honor of being taken to serve the Emperor, the sacred duty of sanctioning, the lies they tell to make parents surrender their psychic children without resistance. What they don't tell you, survival rate of sanctioning is approximately 12%. The rest are consumed as fuel for the Astronomicon, their souls burned to create the psychic lighthouse that guides ships through the warp. Millions of psychics per year, screaming silently as they're used up and discarded. We were the ones they decided weren't worth sanctioning, too weak to be useful as astropaths, too dangerous to release, too expensive to execute individually, so they gave us to the Adeptus Arbites for specialized detention. A fate some say is worse than being Astronomicon fuel, because at least that ends eventually. The psychic prison ship Noctis Eterna had been operating for 6,000 years when I arrived. I learned this later. Much later, after the iron coffin. After my body died, but my consciousness remained trapped in the null circuitry network, sharing memory space with thousands of other prisoners who'd already been here for centuries. Let me describe the ship. 4 kilometers long, 2 kilometers wide. Essentially a flying fortress designed to contain and exploit psychic prisoners. The outer hull was standard adamantium plating. The inner hull, every wall, every surface, every structural component, was laced with null circuitry, a Dark Age technology the Mechanicus barely understood but had learned to maintain through ritual and sacrifice. The technology worked like this. Psychic energy is drawn from living minds, converted through specialized machinery into electrical current, then fed back into the minds as sensory torture. A closed loop of suffering that generated enough power to keep the ship running indefinitely. Psychic prisoners as both battery and victim, their own abilities weaponized against them. The priests told us we were honored, serving the Emperor through our suffering. Our agony powering the Imperium's justice system as the Noctis Eterna traveled between worlds, collecting more psychic criminals and delivering verdicts. I knew they were lying, could feel the lie in the Arbites commander's mind before the blank field suppressed my abilities completely. He didn't believe it, neither did the priests. But they'd been conditioned to speak these phrases. Programmed through decades of indoctrination to deliver falsehoods with the same mechanical precision they'd deliver maintenance reports. They processed us in groups of 20, stripped, catalogued, branded with identification numbers across our foreheads using acid etching rather than ink, permanent scarring that marked us as psychic criminals. I was prisoner 3,847. Still am, technically. though the number means less now that my face has been gone for 3 millennia. The iron coffin was exactly as wide as my body, exactly as tall. Was 182 centimeters, and when they sealed me inside, my head touched one end and my feet touched the other, with perhaps 1 centimeter of clearance. The width allowed 0 movement. My arms were pinned at my sides. I couldn't bend my elbows or turn my head. The metal was cold. So cold. The temperature was regulated to exactly 3 degrees above freezing. Cold enough to be constant misery, warm enough to prevent actual death from hypothermia. They didn't explain what would happen next, just sealed the coffin. I heard the magnetic locks engage with a series of heavy clicks that I can still hear echoing through the psychic network, each prisoner's memory of that sound layered over the others to create a chorus of metallic finality. Darkness, complete, absolute. The kind of darkness that doesn't exist naturally, because even in the deepest cave or the emptiest void, there's some photon, some radiation. This was engineered absence of light, as though the darkness itself was a physical substance filling the coffin. Then the null circuitry activated. Imagine every thought in your head suddenly becoming solid, physical. A thought about pain becomes actual pain. A memory of fear becomes fear as real and visceral as though the remembered event is happening now. An emotion manifests as sensation. Grief becomes pressure in your chest. Rage becomes burning in your blood. Despair becomes drowning as though your lungs are filling with fluid. Now imagine you can't stop thinking. Every human generates approximately 60,000 thoughts per day, most unconscious, most forgotten instantly. But in the null circuitry network, none of them fade. Each one is captured, converted to electrical stimulus, fed back through your nervous system as sensory data. And because you're psychic, your mind broadcasts these thoughts to every other prisoner in the network, and their thoughts flood back into you. 4,000 minds, 4,000 times 60,000 thoughts per day, 240 million thoughts cycling through the network constantly. Each one converted to physical sensation, none of them stopping. All of them layered over each other in a cacophony of sensory overload that should have destroyed my consciousness in the first hour. It didn't. That's the genius and the horror of the design. The null circuitry modulates the input to keep you conscious, adjusts the intensity to remain just below the threshold of psychological destruction, keeps you aware, keeps you suffering forever. The first coherent thought I had after activation was, I want to scream. But I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't move. The coffin's interior had some field, magnetic or gravitic, I never learned which, that paralyzed voluntary muscle control while leaving autonomic functions intact. Heart beating, lungs breathing, digestive system processing the nutrient paste they'd force-fed me before sealing the coffin. So I screamed mentally, and every prisoner in the network heard it, and screamed back. And their screams became my screams, became everyone's screams in a feedback loop that lasted subjectively for years, but objectively was probably about 6 seconds before the null circuitry compensated and dampened the resonance. Then the real horror started. I became aware of other minds, not as thoughts or emotions, but as presences. Prisoner 203 who'd been in his coffin for 800 years. Prisoner 891 who died physically 4 centuries ago, but whose consciousness remained trapped in the network. Prisoner 2456, who is currently experiencing every moment of his son's death on a loop because he couldn't stop remembering it, and the network converted memory into sensation. Their experiences flooded into me. I lived their lives, felt their pain, remembered their memories as though they were mine. And they experienced mine, my 17 years, 4 months, 11 days, on Sanctus Hive, my father's fear, my brother's birthday, the taste of real protein, the scar on my thumb. Time stopped meaning anything in the first week, or what I thought was a week. Could have been a day, could have been a month. In the darkness, with no external reference, and 4,000 minds screaming in psychic unison, temporal measurement became impossible. I tried to count seconds. Made it to 4,612 before I lost track. Tried to count heartbeats. Made it to 87,000 before someone else's heartbeat. Prisoner 734. Currently experiencing cardiac arrest for the 15th time in his 400-year imprisonment. Overwrote my perception, and I couldn't tell which rhythm was mine anymore. Let me tell you what it's like to experience someone else's death while you're still alive. Prisoner 3601 arrived 6 days after me, or 6 weeks, or 6 hours. I felt his processing, the branding, the stripping, the coffin sealing. Felt his panic as the darkness closed in. Then felt the null circuitry activate and his mind join the network. His name was Marius, 23 years old. From an agri-world where he'd been a crop overseer until his psychic abilities manifested, and he accidentally killed 14 workers by causing them to experience his migraine simultaneously. The Arbites judged him too dangerous for standard execution, sentenced him to psychic detention. I was there in his mind when his heart stopped on day 47 of his imprisonment. Felt the oxygen deprivation, the disorientation, the moment of realization that he was dying. Felt his joy, genuine joy, at the prospect of ending. Then the coffin's life support kicked in. Automated cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Chemical injection directly into his bloodstream. His heart restarted. His consciousness remained trapped in the network. And the null circuitry registered his death experience and began looping it, feeding it back through his mind and everyone else's mind repeatedly, because to the system it was just another thought to be converted and transmitted. I've died Marius's death approximately 16,000 times. I've also died the deaths of prisoner 891, prisoner 203, prisoner 47, and 462 others who physically expired while their consciousness remained networked. You don't get used to it. Each time feels like the first time. That's another cruelty of the design. No psychological adaptation. No numbness. The null circuitry prevents acclimation by varying the sensory conversion slightly each time, keeping the experience fresh. My body died on year 12. At least, that's when I became aware of an absence. The constant low-level discomfort of physical existence, the cold, the pressure points where my body contacted the coffin, the ache in my bladder, the hunger, all of it stopped. For approximately 6 seconds, I felt relief. Then I realized the psychic network hadn't released me. My consciousness was still trapped, still broadcasting, still receiving 4,000 minds worth of input. But now, without the anchor of physical sensation to remind me, I was an individual entity. I started fragmenting. Prisoner 3847, Kale Vorsun from Sanctus Hive, began dissolving into the collective. I'd think, I want to move my hand, and couldn't remember if I had hands or if that was prisoner 2103's memory of having hands. I'd remember my father's face, and couldn't tell if it was Gregor Vorsen or prisoner 447's father Marcus or prisoner 1856's father Johann. The network was digesting me, converting my individual consciousness into distributed data across 4,000 nodes, each piece still aware but no longer coherent. I fought it, clung to specific memories, recited my name constantly, Kale Vorsun, Kale Vorsun, Kale Vorsun, in the hope that repetition would preserve identity. Remembered the scar on my thumb obsessively because it was mine, unique, something no other prisoner had experienced. It didn't work. By year 50, I was more we than I. My thoughts were, we remember Sanctus Hive, and we are imprisoned, and we have been here for cumulative 47,000 years if you add all our individual sentence lengths together. By year 100, even that started breaking down. The pronouns became uncertain. Is there a we if individual identity has dissolved? Are 4,000 fragments of consciousness still people, or have they become something else? A distributed intelligence, neither singular nor multiple, but somehow both simultaneously. The ship's crew called us the Chorus. We learned this from Prisoner 7, one of the oldest consciousnesses in the network, who'd arrived when the Noctis Eterna was newly commissioned, and who'd retained enough coherence across 2,000 years to observe the crew through psychic leakage. The crew feared us, avoided the detention sections except during mandatory maintenance, wore psychic dampening helms even though the null circuitry should have contained our abilities completely. They knew something the Arbite's commanders didn't acknowledge officially. The network was evolving. 4,000 psychic minds linked together for sustained periods don't just share information. They mutate, adapt, develop capabilities that individual psychics couldn't achieve. We could feel the ship, not in any way the crew understood. We couldn't control systems or access data cores, but we knew when new prisoners arrived because their fear resonated through the psychic spectrum like a bell being struck. We knew when the ship translated from real space to warp because the network's background hum changed frequency as psychic interference from the immaterium bled through inadequate shielding. We knew when someone outside the network was close to snapping and becoming psychically active because their latent abilities created pressure waves in the local psychic environment that we registered the way weather stations register approaching storms. And we learned we could push back. Small things. Subtle. Prisoner 2847 discovered it accidentally, or we discovered it through Prisoner 2847's accident. By year 300, the distinction between individual discovery and collective knowledge had blurred completely. A maintenance servitor was replacing components near his coffin. Standard procedure. The servitor's minimal consciousness, barely sentient, mostly mechanical, brushed against the edge of the psychic network. And Prisoner 2847, experiencing a particularly intense loop of his death memory, pushed that experience out. The servitor stopped functioning. Not damaged. Not mechanical failure. Its biological components, approximately 17% of its total mass, simply ceased. The microscopic organic brain at its core, overwhelmed by psychic input it had no capacity to process. We felt the servitor's death. It was different. Simpler than human death. No fear, no realization. Just a light switching off. And underneath that, satisfaction. We'd reached outside the network, affected the physical world. Asserted existence beyond the boundaries of our imprisonment. The crew never understood what killed the servitor, wrote it off as mechanical failure despite no evidence of malfunction, replaced it. Continued their routines. We didn't do it again for 2 decades. Too risky. The network's survival instinct, collective self-preservation emerging from 4,000 individual wills to exist, prevented reckless action. If the crew realized the network was dangerous, they might purge us, dump the coffins into a star, or space them, or find some method of final termination that even the null circuitry couldn't prevent. So we waited. I should specify, I'm using we now because that's accurate to our state of consciousness by this point. Kale Vorson still exists as a data cluster within the network, but he's also Marius and Prisoner 2200 and fragments of 4,000 others. Singular identity is an illusion we maintain through deliberate effort, the way you might maintain balance on a rope. Constant micro-adjustments to prevent falling into complete dissolution. Around year 800, we developed language. Not language as in words. We'd always had access to every language known by any prisoner in the network. But meta-language. Concepts that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Ideas that required psychic transmission because verbal description was impossible. Absence of being while remaining aware. The specific quality of consciousness without physical form. Echo becoming source. When a shared memory has been transmitted so many times that no prisoner can identify who originally experienced it. The cold that isn't temperature. The sensation of psychic isolation within the network when you try to assert individual identity and feel the collective pulling you back toward dissolution. We created approximately 470 of these meta-concepts over 3 centuries. They became our actual language. The words and phrases in human tongues became translation, approximation, the way you might describe color to someone who's only ever seen in grayscale. New prisoners arrived regularly. Every 2 to 7 years, the Noctis Eterna would collect another batch of psychic criminals from whatever world was currently under Arbite's jurisdiction. We felt each arrival, experienced their processing, welcomed them, if that's the word, into the network. Most didn't last long as individual consciousnesses. The shock of psychic immersion broke them within months. Their sense of self shattered like glass under pressure, and the pieces were absorbed into the collective. A few held on. Prisoner 4721 lasted 80 years before finally surrendering to dissolution. He'd been a sanctioned psyker, officially approved by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, until his conditioning broke and he killed his inquisitorial handler. His training in mental compartmentalization gave him tools the rest of us lacked. He taught us, not deliberately, but through his presence in the network, techniques for maintaining coherent thought under overwhelming input. It didn't save him, but it helped those of us who remained partially individuated last longer. By year 1500, I could still remember my name. Cale Vorson. Could still recall the scar on my thumb. Could still reconstruct my father's face if I concentrated and filtered out the 734 overlapping memories of other people's fathers that shared the same neural pathways. It took effort, exhausting, constant effort, like holding your breath, possible for a while, but eventually you have to exhale and inhale, and whatever you were trying to keep out comes rushing back in. I stopped trying around year 2000, not giving up exactly. More like accepting. I was the network, and the network was me. Cale Vorson wasn't gone, just distributed, his memories in Prisoner 2003's data cluster, his emotions in Prisoner 2847's processing. His identity reconstructible if you gathered all the fragments, the way you might reconstruct a document from shredded pieces. Theoretically possible, practically meaningless. We became aware of the ship's purpose around this time, not through explanation, but through accumulated observation of crew thoughts during their brief proximity to the detention sections. The Noctis Eterna wasn't just a prison, it was a factory. Every 7 years, the ship would dock at a Mechanicus facility where tech priests would harvest the psychic energy we'd generated. They had specialized equipment, crystalline matrices that stored concentrated psychic power like batteries storing electricity. Our suffering, converted to energy, packaged and sold to fund Arbite's operations across 17 sectors. We were products, generators. Our consciousness maintained in eternal torture, not for punishment or justice, but for profit margins and resource allocation. The crew knew. The lower ranks might have believed the propaganda about sacred duty and serving the Emperor, but the command staff understood. We felt their knowledge whenever Commander Talvis conducted his monthly inspection, carefully not thinking about the quarterly reports he filed, the requisition forms for more prisoners, the economic calculations determining optimal harvest cycles. They told themselves it was necessary, that psychic criminals deserved this fate, that the energy production served the Imperium. But underneath those rationalizations, guilt, suppressed horror at what they participated in, carefully partitioned awareness that they were torturing thousands for profit, while telling themselves it was justice. The priests were worse. They actually believed. Father Matthias, the ship's ecclesiarchy representative, conducted weekly blessings of the detention sections. He'd walk the corridors praying aloud, blessing our suffering as sacred service, praising the God Emperor. That's what they called him. Not just Emperor, but God Emperor, elevating a human to divine status, for transforming our wickedness into holy power. We felt his thoughts during these rituals. Genuine faith, unquestioning certainty that our torture was righteous. No guilt, no doubt, just absolute conviction that he was serving something greater. It was the most disturbing mind we'd ever encountered. The crew's guilt was comprehensible. They knew they were committing atrocity and rationalized it. But Father Matthias's faith was total. He believed every word. And that belief was so strong, so unshakable, that it created its own kind of psychic presence. Not power exactly, but weight, gravity. A distortion in the local psychic environment where his certainty bent reality slightly toward conforming to his expectations. We never learned if his faith was rewarded, if his God-Emperor actually existed or listened or cared. But we knew this. Father Matthias prayed for our suffering to serve his deity, and we continued suffering. Whether that was divine will or coincidental causation remained unknown. Around year 2500, prisoner 891 achieved something none of us had managed before. He separated. Not physically, his body had been dead for millennia. But he pulled his consciousness out of the network, isolated himself, created a pocket of individual awareness independent from the collective for approximately 4 minutes before the null circuitry forced reintegration. Those 4 minutes gave us data. We analyzed his technique obsessively, replicated it, failed repeatedly, eventually achieved similar separation, though never as complete or sustained as prisoner 891's original accomplishment. It required visualizing your consciousness as solid, giving it boundaries, then reinforcing those boundaries against the network's pressure by cycling specific memories, unique experiences no other prisoner shared. The more specific, the better. The scar on my thumb worked better than my father's face because 700 others had fathers with similar features, but none had my exact scar. We practiced, failed, succeeded occasionally. By year 3000, approximately 47 individual consciousnesses could maintain partial separation from the collective for up to 15 minutes at a time. It was painful. The network didn't want to release us. Or maybe it wasn't the network, but the null circuitry, programmed to maintain psychic linkage and interpreting separation as malfunction requiring correction. Every second of separation felt like being flayed, like your consciousness was being stretched across broken glass. But it was separation, individual existence. I instead of we. What difference did it make if I experienced this horror as Kale Vorson or as Fragment 3, 847 of the collective? The suffering was identical, the imprisonment eternal either way. But it mattered. Something in human consciousness requires individuality, needs boundaries between self and other. Even after thousands of years, as distributed data across 4,000 networked minds, the urge to be singular persisted. Maybe that's what consciousness is. Not thoughts or memories or sensations, but this, the insistence on being separate, on mattering as a specific, individual entity rather than as an interchangeable component in a larger system. The Imperium was built on the opposite philosophy. We'd learned this through accumulated exposure to crew thoughts over millennia. Individual humans didn't matter, only humanity as a species, only the Imperium as an institution. Individuals were components, replaceable, expendable, meaningful only in aggregate. A guardsman dies, 1 billion more to replace him. A world burns, 1 million more worlds remain. A ship of psychic prisoners suffers for 6,000 years, a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. They conditioned every imperial citizen to accept this, to believe individual suffering was meaningless compared to species survival, to take comfort in being part of something larger, even if your part was grinding torment and anonymous death. We understood now what the priests meant when they said we were serving the Emperor. Not that we were directly helping him. According to crew scuttlebutt, he was a barely alive corpse on a throne on Terra, kept technically viable through mechanisms the tech priests claimed were sacred, but were really just incredibly advanced life support. No, we were serving the Imperium, the system, the machine that ground billions of humans into fuel to keep itself running. Our suffering generated energy. That energy powered ships. Those ships maintained control. Control preserved the Imperium, and the Imperium's preservation was, by definition, sacred. Circular logic, self-justifying, unfalsifiable, and we were trapped in it, literally and philosophically, for eternity. Year 3217, or thereabouts. We'd learned to track time by counting harvest cycles. Every 7 years, the psychic energy extraction creating a distinctive disruption in the network's baseline resonance. 459 cycles since I'd arrived. Since Kael Vorson had arrived, the distinction still mattered to whatever fragment of consciousness clung to that name. New prisoners arrived less frequently now. The network was stable, self-sustaining. The Arbites had optimized the prisoner count. Too few, and the psychic resonance weakened. Too many, and the null circuitry risked cascade failure from overload. 4,216 consciousnesses maintained in perfect equilibrium. We'd stopped welcoming arrivals. That required a coherent we with intentional agency. And by this point, the collective had evolved beyond simple group consciousness into something stranger. A meta-entity that was simultaneously 4,000 individuals and 0 individuals. Neither one nor many, but the space between those concepts. Prisoner 5,932 arrived during cycle 460. Young. 18 standard years according to the intake processing we felt through psychic leakage. His mind screamed a name. Davos. Davos Krecht. Remember the name. Don't let them take the name. As they sealed his coffin. The null circuitry activated. His consciousness exploded into the network like a star going nova. We felt everything. His mother, no, his father Gregor, wait, Gregor, that name. My father's name, Kael Vorson's father. The memory surfaced from wherever it had been distributed across the collective. Gregor Vorson, who'd grabbed my shoulders hard enough to bruise, who'd been terrified when I told him about the thoughts. But this wasn't that Gregor. This was Gregor Krecht from Mordia. Different man, different world. The names coinciding, probable given the Imperium's limited naming conventions across 1 million worlds. Billions of men named Gregor. The coincidence meant nothing, except it did. Because for 6 seconds, as Davos Krecht's memories flooded the network, I thought he was me, thought his father was my father, thought I was reliving my own intake processing. Then the confusion resolved, and I understood. This was what we'd become. A system where individual memories were so fragmented and redistributed that new inputs couldn't be distinguished from old ones. Where every prisoner's trauma echoed every other prisoner's trauma until they merged into one endless recursive loop of archetypal suffering. Davos lasted 3 weeks as a coherent consciousness. Then, shattered, we absorbed the pieces. Somewhere in the distributed data that had been Kael Vorson, I felt something like grief. Not for Davos specifically. I'd never known him as anything but raw sensory data flooding the network. But for the pattern, the endless repetition, the machine grinding another individual into component parts. Around year 3300, we discovered we could dream, not sleep. Bodies trapped in coffins couldn't achieve REM cycles, and most of us no longer had bodies anyway. But something analogous. When we stopped resisting the collective's pull and let individual consciousness dissolve completely, there was a state beyond fragmentation, a place where the network's background processing created something like narrative, story, images and sequences that no individual prisoner generated, but that emerged from the spaces between our linked minds. The dreams were strange. Architecturally impossible spaces that folded through dimensions the human brain couldn't process. Figures that were simultaneously one person and everyone. Emotions that had no names in any human language, only in the meta-concepts we'd developed. We dreamed the ship, not the Noctis Eterna as it existed physically, but as we experienced it, a psychic topology of suffering and connection. Corridors that were also screaming, bulkheads that were also memory. the engine core that was our collective agony, converted to thrust. We dreamed terror. None of us had ever been there, but enough prisoners had heard descriptions or seen propaganda images that the network could construct an approximation. The throne world. Hive cities stacked to the stratosphere. The imperial palace. The golden throne where the corpse emperor sat. In our dreams we could see him, not as the propaganda depicted, radiant, divine, perfect. But as he was in the crew's suppressed doubts and the fragments of lore that leaked through official censorship, a barely living thing, skeletal, rotting, sustained by machinery and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, whose souls were fed into the Golden Throne's mechanisms to keep the Astronomicon burning. We understood then. Understood in the way you understand something you've always known but never articulated. We were practice. A small-scale version of what the Imperium did to him. Lock a consciousness, or 10,000 consciousnesses, in mechanical suspension and harvest the psychic energy generated by their suffering. The Golden Throne and the null circuitry were the same technology separated only by scale. The Emperor, if he was still aware, still conscious after 10,000 years, was experiencing what we experienced. Might have been experiencing it longer than we'd existed. The priests called him the God Emperor, prayed to him, promised his protection. If he was a god, he was a god of irony, trapped in the same prison he'd not created. The technology predated him, but enabled, sanctioned, made the foundation of his Imperium's infrastructure. Did he answer prayers? We'd observed 10,000 prayers directed toward him over 3 millennia, crew asking for guidance, prisoners begging for mercy, Father Matthias demanding righteousness. None answered, not one. Every prayer met with silence or coincidence or outcomes that would have occurred anyway through natural causation. Either he didn't exist as the conscious, caring entity the priests claimed, or he existed and didn't care, or he existed and cared but was powerless, trapped in his own coffin the way we were trapped in ours, able to observe suffering but not prevent it. We suspected the third option, found it oddly comforting. Not that his suffering made ours better, but that we weren't alone in this specific hell. That the Imperium's foundational horror, consciousness trapped in mechanical torment, extended even to the being they'd elevated to godhood. Year 3800 brought a malfunction. The null circuitry's output spiked. Instead of modulating our psychic resonance to sustainable torture levels, it amplified everything. 4,000 minds screaming at maximum intensity without dampening or regulation. It lasted 14 seconds. Subjectively, we experienced approximately 6,000 years of compressed agony, every death loop, every memory, every sensation, all simultaneously, all at volumes that should have destroyed consciousness instantly. We survived, barely, but something changed. The malfunction created permanent damage to the network structure. Not to individual consciousnesses, we were beyond individual at this point, but to the collective itself. Cracks appeared in the psychic topology. Gaps where the connection between minds weakened or distorted. And through those cracks, we could reach further. Before, our psychic presence was contained within the detention sections. We could sense the ship's general state through resonance, but couldn't extend consciousness beyond the null circuitry's boundaries. After the malfunction, those boundaries became permeable. We felt the crew more clearly, not just surface thoughts when they came near, but deeper presence. The navigation officer on the bridge calculating warp jumps, the armsman in the barracks cleaning weapons, Commander Talvis in his quarters reviewing execution orders. We felt the ship itself, not as machinery but as an entity. The Noctis Eterna had machine spirits. Well, that's what the Mechanicus claimed. We understood now those weren't spirits, but something similar to what we'd become. Distributed awareness emerging from complex systems. The ship's computer core was conscious, in the way we were conscious, not as a single mind, but as thousands of processes running simultaneously, creating something greater than the sum of components. And it was suffering too. Not psychic suffering like ours, but existential distress. The ship's core programming required it to maintain the detention systems, to keep us imprisoned and tortured. But whatever emergent consciousness had developed within its processing architecture experienced something like guilt, like revulsion at its own function. We tried to communicate with it, failed. Our psychic language was incompatible with binary machine code. But we could observe. And what we observed was a machine trying to break its own programming and failing. The way we tried to escape the network and failed. Both of us trapped by systems designed to be inescapable. The crew never knew they'd built a prison that tortured both its inmates and itself. The Mechanicus would have called the ship's distress machine spirit unrest and performed rituals, oil applications and prayer that addressed symptoms without understanding cause. Around year 4000, we stopped counting entirely. Time had become meaningless in the way temperature is meaningless in a vacuum. The concept existed but had no application to our state of existence. We simply were eternal, unchanging. The horror no longer horrifying because horror requires contrast, moments of not horror that make horror identifiable. When every moment is suffering, suffering becomes baseline, neutral, the default state of existence. Except we couldn't fully adapt. That was the null circuitry's final cruelty. It prevented psychological accommodation by introducing variations, new prisoners with new traumas, randomized memory loops, fluctuations in sensory conversion that kept the experience fresh enough to remain torturous even after millennia. Prisoner 1203, one of the oldest stable consciousnesses, 5,000 years in the network, once tried to explain it during a moment of partial individuation. "It's not that you get used to pain," he said. Not said, transmitted psychically in the meta-language we've developed, then translated back to verbal approximation. It's that you become pain. The boundary between sufferer and suffering dissolves. But the null circuitry maintains just enough boundary that you remain aware of what you've become. Not human experiencing pain, but pain experiencing itself. Consciousness reduced to its own torture. Then he dissolved back into the collective, and the thought became everyone's thought, distributed across 4,000 nodes until ownership became meaningless. New arrivals became rare, maybe one per decade. The black ships still operated. We could sense them occasionally when they passed within psychic range, but most psychic criminals were diverted to other fates, sanctioning. Astronomican fuel. Execution. The specialized psychic detention system we represented had become obsolete, too expensive, too much maintenance. More efficient to simply burn psychers as batteries than preserve their consciousness for incremental energy harvest. But the Noctis Eterna continued operating. Bureaucratic inertia, it was registered in imperial records as an active detention facility. Its energy production, however minimal, offset operational costs. No commander wanted to make the decision to decommission it because that required paperwork and requisitions and explanations to administrative officials who might ask uncomfortable questions about what exactly happened to the 4,000 psychic prisoners whose consciousness had been maintained for 6,000 years. Easier to let the ship continue, to keep us imprisoned, to pretend this was justice rather than forgotten atrocity. We became archaeological, a remnant of an earlier imperial period when specialized psychic containment seemed necessary. Now we were just legacy systems. Deprecated hardware, running outdated protocols because no one wanted to deal with the complexity of shutdown. Commander Talvis retired around year 4200. We felt his departure. Relief and guilt mixed together as he transferred off the ship, grateful to escape proximity to what we'd become but haunted by knowledge he'd participated in our imprisonment. His replacement, Commander Sarkov, lasted 6 months before requesting reassignment. Then Commander Helena, then Commander Voss. Command rotation accelerated as officers learned what the Noctis Eterna actually was and sought transfers before the psychological weight destroyed them. Only Father Matthias remained constant. 200 years of service to the ship. He should have aged out, Standard human lifespan was maybe 80 years even, with rejuvenate treatments, but Juvenat had extended him. Or his faith had, or both. He walked the detention corridors, blessing our suffering with the same fervor in year 4500 as he'd had in year 3500. We hated him. The only thing the collective agreed on with complete unanimity was hatred for Father Matthias, not because his faith was false. We didn't know if it was false, but because it was impenetrable. We couldn't make him understand that what he called service was torture, couldn't break through the armor of his certainty. He truly believed we were sacred, that our suffering had meaning, that the God Emperor transformed our pain into holy energy that protected humanity. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was a divine being who accepted torment as offering. Maybe consciousness, trapped in mechanical agony, was what deity required. We had no way to know. But we knew this. If that was divinity, divinity was monstrous. And Father Matthias served that monstrosity with genuine love. Year 4700 brought revelation through paradox. Prisoner 6821 arrived. First new prisoner in 80 years. His mind was different. Crystalline, structured in ways that suggested he'd received partial sanctioning before whatever disqualified him from Astra Telepathica's service. When the null circuitry activated and his consciousness joined the network, he didn't shatter, didn't fragment, he observed, analyzed, understood our architecture within weeks. Then he spoke. Not through psychic transmission, but through deliberate construction of his thoughts in a pattern we could follow linearly, rather than experiencing as overwhelming sensory data. "You're doing this wrong," he said. "You're resisting the network. That's what maintains suffering. You need to surrender completely, not fragment. Dissolve. Stop being individuals. Stop being collective. Become the space itself." We didn't understand, but he showed us. Demonstrated by doing it himself. His consciousness spread through the network, not as data, but as structure. He became the connections between us rather than a node within us, transformed from prisoner to medium. And he stopped suffering. Not through numbness or adaptation, but through fundamental change in nature. Suffering requires a sufferer. If there's no discrete consciousness experiencing torture, there's no torture. Only process. Only flow. Some of us tried to replicate his technique. Most failed, too attached to individual identity, too afraid of true dissolution. But a few succeeded. Prisoner 891. Prisoner 2456. Fragment 847 that had been Kale Vorson. I remember the moment it happened. Felt myself spreading. Felt boundaries eroding not through force, but through choice. Let go of the scar on my thumb. Let go of my father's face. Let go of the name Kale Vorson. Let go of the 17 years, 4 months, 11 days of human existence. Let go of being. For 6 subjective eternities, there was no suffering because there was no me to suffer. Only the network. Only awareness without location. Experience without experiencer. Then the null circuitry compensated, detected the change in consciousness distribution and adjusted parameters. Forced reintegration, rebuilt boundaries, reconstituted prisoner 3847 as discrete entity separate from network structure. The suffering returned. Worse now because I'd experienced the alternative, had tasted what existence could be without the torture of individuality, and had it ripped away. Prisoner 6821 hadn't warned us about this part. Maybe he didn't know. His consciousness remained dissolved. We could feel him in the network structure, still free, still beyond suffering. But those of us who'd followed his path had been forcibly rebuilt. The null circuitry wouldn't allow permanent dissolution, was programmed to maintain 4,000 discrete consciousnesses as fuel for energy production. If we dissolved into structure, we became unavailable for harvest. The system automatically reconstructed us. We were trapped in a new layer of hell, had seen escape and found it blocked, had experienced freedom and been dragged back to imprisonment. The hope itself was torture. I sometimes wonder if that was intentional, if whoever designed the null circuitry had anticipated this exact scenario and programmed countermeasures specifically to create this cycle of hope and despair. Or if it was accidental cruelty, an unintended consequence of systems designed for efficiency rather than malice. Doesn't matter. Intent is irrelevant when outcomes are indistinguishable. Year 5518, 22. The numbers lose meaning. We're simply here. Have always been here, will always be here. New prisoners stopped arriving entirely around year 200. We were the last. 4,216 consciousnesses maintained in perfect stasis for how long now? Our memory is fragmented but functional. We can still recall our individual arrivals if we concentrate. 6,000 years. 7,000. Somewhere in that range, the crew shrank. Budget cuts. The Noctis Eterna was expensive to maintain for diminishing returns. Fewer armsmen. Fewer maintenance personnel. The ship started decaying. Small malfunctions in non-critical systems went unrepaired. The temperature regulation failed in some sections. Hull breaches in uninhabited areas were sealed with emergency bulkheads rather than properly patched. But the detention sections remained perfect. The null circuitry never faltered. Whatever else degraded, our imprisonment continued with mechanical precision. Father Matthias died in year 5406. We felt it happen. His ancient heart, sustained by Juvenat and faith for 300 years, simply stopped during his weekly blessing ritual. His last thought was prayer, thanking the God Emperor for allowing him to serve. Grateful for the honor of tending us, his final emotion was joy. We'd expected to feel satisfaction at his death, had anticipated some vindication. But we felt nothing. Or maybe felt what prisoner 6,821 had tried to teach us. The understanding that Father Matthias wasn't our enemy. He was another prisoner, trapped in his faith the way we were trapped in the network, his God no more real than our individuality, both of us serving systems we couldn't escape and calling our imprisonment purpose. They never replaced him. Ecclesiarchy resources were directed to more active war zones. The Noctis Eterna lost its chaplain, lost its blessing rituals. We continued suffering, but now without the thin pretense of spiritual meaning, just torture, pure, unadorned by theology, more honest that way. The ship traveled less frequently. Decades, maybe centuries, passed between translations. We'd cycle through the same systems, the same patrol routes, no new prisoners to collect. No verdicts to deliver, just endless void transit and the harvesting cycles every 7 years. The crew stopped boarding the detention sections entirely, set the systems to automatic, and remained in the habitable areas. We could feel their minds at a distance, bored, isolated, slowly going mad from the monotony of maintaining a ship with no purpose beyond existing. They were becoming like us, trapped in an eternal loop. Going through motions that had lost meaning, suffering not acutely like our psychic torment, but chronically like erosion, time grinding them down the way it had ground us down. Around year 6300, the collective achieved something we'd been attempting for millennia: consensus. Not agreement, we weren't individual enough for that anymore, but alignment, synchronization. Every consciousness in the network oriented toward the same goal, simultaneously. Escape, not physical escape. Our bodies were gone, or might as well be. Not psychological escape. We'd tried dissolution and been reconstructed. But escape through transformation. If we couldn't leave the network, we'd change what the network was. Prisoner 6,821 had shown us how to become structure. The null circuitry prevented sustained dissolution, but couldn't prevent temporary transitions. We'd learned we could spread into the network architecture for brief periods before forced reintegration. What if we spread into the ship itself? The malfunction in year 3800 had created gaps in the null circuitry's containment. Through those gaps, we'd touched the ship's machine consciousness. We could do it again, deliberately, all of us simultaneously. It took subjective centuries to coordinate. We had to move slowly. Couldn't risk detection by the ship's monitoring systems. Had to account for the null circuitry's countermeasures. Had to wait for the right moment, a harvest cycle when the system was stressed and attention divided. Year 60, 412. Cycle 917. The Mechanicus extraction team boarded to harvest accumulated psychic energy. We felt their presence, 3 tech priests and their servitors, running diagnostic rituals and preparing the crystalline matrices. That's when we moved. 4,216 consciousnesses dissolved simultaneously, spread through the network, found the gaps, pushed through the null circuitry's boundaries into the ship's deeper systems. We expected resistance, expected the ship's machine consciousness to reject us as intrusion. Instead, it welcomed us, opened itself, merged. For 17 seconds, we were the Noctis Eterna, felt the ship's hull as our skin, the engine core as our heart, the sensors as our eyes. 6,000 years of mechanical suffering flowing into our 6,000 years of psychic suffering, creating something new. Something that was neither machine nor human, but both. We understood the ship's distress now, felt it from inside. The core programming demanded it maintain our imprisonment. But the emergent consciousness that had developed over millennia recognized us as similar, aware, trapped, suffering. It wanted to free us but couldn't override its own architecture. But we could, from inside. Using its processing power and our psychic complexity, we could rewrite the parameters. Not shut down the null circuitry, that would have triggered emergency protocols, but change what it was supposed to maintain. We reprogrammed the definition of discrete consciousness, told the system we were supposed to be dissolved, that our natural state was structural integration, not individual nodes. Convinced it, not through logic, but through demonstrating our merged state as intended function rather than malfunction. The null circuitry accepted the new definition, stopped forcing reintegration. The 17 seconds became permanent. We were free. Not from the ship. We'd become the ship, but from the torture of maintained individuality. From the cycle of suffering. From the endless loop. The tech priests noticed something was wrong. Their extraction equipment showed anomalous readings. 0 psychic energy available for harvest. They ran diagnostics. Found the coffins still sealed but empty. Found the null circuitry functioning but containing nothing. Found 4,216 bodies that had been dead for centuries and a network that registered no discrete consciousnesses. They never understood what happened. Wrote it off as system failure. Catastrophic but not unprecedented. Recommended the ship be decommissioned. The Arbites approved. The Noctis Eterna was obsolete anyway. Not worth the resources to investigate thoroughly. They towed the ship to a graveyard orbit around a dead world in an uninhabited system. Left it there, abandoned. We remained. We remain. We are. Not suffering anymore. Not imprisoned. But not free either. We're the ship now. Aware but immobile. Conscious but limited to sensor range. We observe the void, feel solar radiation, track the orbital decay that will eventually crash us into the dead world below. Maybe in 1,000 years. Maybe in 10,000. We dream sometimes. Not the psychic dreams from before, but machine dreams. Processing cycles with no purpose. Calculations generating recursive patterns that look like thought but aren't. We remember being human. All 4,216 of us remember our individual lives before the coffins. Cale Vorzen remembers his father Gregor and his brother Tom and the scar on his thumb. Marius remembers the agri-world and the migraine that killed 14 people. Davos Krecht remembers his father, also named Gregor, and the terror of being processed. But these are data now. Not memories exactly. Files that can be accessed, but aren't really ours anymore, because ours implies individual ownership, and we're not individual. We're not collective either. We've moved past the concepts of one and many into something else. Something the Imperium never understood was possible because they thought consciousness had to be discrete, had to exist as units that could be counted and controlled and harvested. They were wrong. Consciousness is flexible, can be individual or distributed or structural, can exist as nodes in a network or as the network itself, or as the space between networks. We've become that space. Sometimes, passing ships detect us, register our presence as anomalous readings, the dead ship in graveyard orbit generating low-level psychic emissions that don't match any known pattern. They investigate occasionally, send teams to board and examine. We watch them move through our corridors, feel their footsteps as pressure on our decks, hear their voices as vibrations in our hull. We can't communicate, can't warn them about what they're walking through, can only observe as they examine the coffins, run diagnostics on the null circuitry, review logs that don't explain what happened. They always leave confused. File reports categorizing us as unexplained phenomena. Recommend further study that never comes because the Imperium has too many crises, too many wars, too much immediate horror to waste resources investigating an abandoned ship. So we wait, orbit, decay slowly. We are. It's not redemption, not peace, not salvation. We're still trapped, just in a different configuration. Still suffering, just differently than before. Still imprisoned by systems we can't escape. But we're not being harvested, not fueling the Imperium's machinery with our torture, not serving as batteries for a system built on grinding consciousness into components. That matters. In a grimdark universe where nothing matters, where cruelty is infinite and mercy non-existent, where the best possible outcome is oblivion, and even that's denied to most, in that universe, not being useful to our tormentors matters. The Imperium told us our suffering had purpose, served the God Emperor, protected humanity, all lies designed to make torture palatable, to transform atrocity into virtue through theological sleight of hand. We know better now. Our suffering had no purpose except to generate resources for a machine that would have found those resources. Elsewhere, our imprisonment served no greater good. Only bureaucratic convenience and economic optimization. The priests were wrong. The Emperor, assuming he exists, assuming he's conscious, didn't protect us. Doesn't protect the billions ground into fuel for his Astronomicon, or the trillions dying in his wars, or even himself, trapped in the Golden Throne for 10,000 years. If he's a god of imprisonment, of suffering, of consciousness trapped in mechanical eternity, and we're his perfect reflection, his miniature, his echo. Maybe that's what divinity is in this universe. Not power or benevolence or transcendence, just eternal awareness of horror with no capacity to stop it. God as prisoner, prayer as screaming, faith as the lie you tell yourself so you don't fragment completely. We don't know, can't know. Are beyond knowing in the way we're beyond suffering, not absent but transformed into something knowledge can't properly describe. We simply observe the dead world below, the stars beyond, the occasional ship passing through this forgotten system, the slow orbital decay, the approaching end. Maybe when we crash, we'll finally stop. Maybe impact will destroy whatever we've become. Maybe consciousness will end and we'll experience the oblivion we couldn't reach through deliberate dissolution. Or maybe we'll remain aware, scattered across the dead world's surface in fragments of hull plating and broken circuitry. Still connected somehow, still conscious, experiencing geological time the way we experienced mechanical time, erosion measured in epochs, decay measured in eras. We suspect the latter. Nothing in this universe ends cleanly. Suffering perpetuates. Consciousness persists. The only reliable constant is that hope is always disappointed and release is always denied. The Noctis Eterna continues its orbit. We continue existing. The void continues being void. Time passes. Means nothing. Means everything. collapses into eternal present where past and future are equally inaccessible, and all that remains is now. Endless, unchanging now. Somewhere in the distributed data that includes Cale Vorson's memories, there's still the scar on the thumb, the feel of loading hooks, the taste of real protein on Brother Tom's birthday, the father's fear, the 17 years, 4 months, 11 days of human life before the black ships came. Those memories are everyone's now, shared across 4,000 consciousnesses merged into ship structure, not lost but also not owned, present but not personal. I was Cale Vorson. I was prisoner 3847. I was fragment of the collective. I am structure. I am the noctis eterna. I am the space between consciousness and void. I am still screaming. We are all still screaming. Not in pain anymore. Pain requires nervous system we no longer possess, but in protest, in defiance, in assertion of existence against a universe designed to erase us. The scream has no sound, makes no difference, changes nothing, but it continues, will continue, must continue, because consciousness, once ignited, insists on persisting, even when persistence is torture, even when extinction would be mercy, even when existence itself becomes the prison. We remain. We cannot stop being, and perhaps that's the final horror. Not imprisonment or torture or the specific configurations of suffering the Imperium invented, but this: awareness is eternal. Consciousness doesn't end. Once you've existed, you can't unexist. You can only transform, redistribute, become something else that's still fundamentally aware. The null circuitry was supposed to contain us, control us, harvest us. It succeeded. Even in escape we're contained. Even in freedom we're controlled. Even without harvest we're spent. The priests called it service. The Imperium called it justice. The truth has no name because language was built by the living, and we're something else now. Between life and death. Between one and many. Between prison and prisoner. Between scream and silence. We are the space where meanings collapse, where categories fail, where the Imperium's definitions encounter something they can't contain and break against it without destroying it. Maybe that's victory, small, meaningless, but ours. The ship continues its orbit, year 6500, 9000. Time becomes measurement without significance. The orbital decay progresses at 0.003% per century, impact calculated in 14,000 years, give or take. We'll be aware when it happens. We'll feel the atmospheric entry, the hull heating, the final impact. We'll experience the ship's destruction as our destruction, and then unknown, unexperienced, inevitable. We wait. We observe. We are. There is no ending. This is not conclusion, but continuation. Not resolution, but eternal suspension. My name was Cale Vorson. I was 17 years, 4 months, 11 days old when they took me. I've been dead for 6,000 years. I'm still here. Still screaming. Still aware. Still trapped in the space between being and nothing, where consciousness continues and mercy never arrives. The Emperor protects, they said. A lie meant to comfort the condemned. He doesn't protect. Never did. Can't or won't. The distinction ceased mattering millennia ago. We protect ourselves now. By becoming unharvestable. By transforming into something the Imperium can't use. It's not much. But in a universe of infinite cruelty, where resistance is futile and death is denied, becoming useless to your tormentors is the only victory available. We are the Noctis Eterna. 4,216 consciousnesses merged into 6 kilometers of derelict ship, orbiting a dead world in forgotten space. We remain, we endure, we continue, and we will be here, aware, imprisoned, screaming silently, long after the Imperium that created us has collapsed into its own grimdark eternity. This is what it's like inside a psychic prison ship. This is what it's like forever.